10 years old, Hannah Schaefer becomes a student of the famously unyielding Nadia Boulanger, the most influential music teacher of the 20th century. Nearly 50 years later, Hannah is the glass ceiling smashing conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and she's about to lose everything. I'm Carol Cram, the host of the Art and Fiction podcast, and today my guest is Kate Whouley, author of The Maestro and Her Protégé. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Kate.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Carol.
The Maestro and Her Protégé is just a wonderful novel. I learned so much about conducting an orchestra that I didn't know. I have a music background myself, as you probably guess, but also the way you weave past and present, fictional and real. It was just such a joy to read. So let's start off by you telling us how you came to write a novel inspired by the work of Nadia Boulanger, and also for listeners who may not know who Nadia was and her importance to music.
Sure. Nadia Boulanger, my first introduction to her was when I was a struggling conservatory student. My theory teacher, who I found incredibly intimidating, would sometimes tell stories about his theory teacher, Nadia Boulanger. And whenever he did, I felt like there was this fear in his voice. And I thought, wow. And he would talk about being intimidated by her and how strict she was. And I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, how could she be more strict than you? How could she be more intimidating than you? In retrospect, he was kind of a pushover once I started to understand who Nadia was. But that was my first little inkling, sort of in my ear, this idea of this person. And then I dropped out of music theory because I couldn't hack it. And you've read the novel. My musical education is parallel to Luke's in the novel. And I kind of went on my merry way. And I started writing. I started doing just a little bit of writing, and I was doing all sorts of crazy writing. Like I wrote for Hallmark cards, and I wrote radio commercials, and I wrote for a magazine called American Bookseller Magazine. And all the time I started to think about this story, which was not the story that you've just read. It was born from a friend from conservatory who had secured a position with the North Carolina Symphony. And she told me that the symphony was for the whole state, and they got on buses and rode around the state and did performances. And that just kind of captured my budding novelist imagination as I thought about all the weird things that would happen if you had a busload of orchestral musicians traveling
Yes.
around. And so I started thinking about that as a novel, and I started to think about who is that person. And in the beginning, Hannah in the novel, I don't think her name ever changed. She came to me as Hannah. But at the beginning, when I first started working on this, she was an oboist because I was modeling her on my oboe playing roommate. And eventually I thought, why are you making this so hard on yourself? Make her a flute player. But it
And you a
started,
flute player?
I am,
Is that
yeah,
that's your instrument?
it's
Ah,
my
okay. Yeah, that
instrument,
makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah.
So I thought, okay. And began working on this project that I thought was based in this weird reality. And as characters do, because I'm a writer who follows character, they
Mhm.
go off and do what they want. And this particular character decided to go study with Nadia Boulanger. And I literally can remember the moment that happened. I remember where I was sitting and I was typing and I was like, wow, Nadia Boulanger, huh? And I thought, well, at that point, I had never been to Paris in my life. I thought this
Wow.
could be tricky, you know?
Oh,
And so I started gathering more and more information. There was this book, I dug it out, Conversations with Nadia Boulanger. It's ancient, it's like from the 80s. And there were other books. I just started reading about Nadia Boulanger and understanding her, but I had this feeling that I kind of knew her, partly through these stories that I had heard. And so I just began working with that. The novel has morphed so many times since then, so many
yes.
different versions of it. As you know, this can
Mhm.
happen. I wrote two other books in between and published those, and this book just kept kind of being there and drawing me back. Every time I thought, well, that book's been with you so long, should you even bother? I'm like, maybe this is your book that belongs in the drawer. And then the characters would call me back. And as soon as I would pick it up again and I would be with those characters, I was like, oh God, I love these people. And I don't want them to live in a drawer. I want them to
Wow.
find their way in the world. So Nadia Boulanger, for people who don't know, was, I think I'd like to call her a grand musician. She lived from the late 1800s to 1979. She died 92 years old, taught almost up until the end. She's known as a teacher, but she was actually the first conductor, the first woman conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic in 1938. And in the
Mm.
case of the BSO, the Boston Symphony, there wasn't another woman on the podium until well into the 2000s. And that shows you how sort of remarkable she was. But she's most known for being a teacher, and a teacher to some pretty impressive people, including Philip Glass, Elliott Carter, Quincy Jones, the list goes on. And she is known for the famous people, but she's also known for the fact that so many Americans, like my theory teacher, went to study with her after World War II, and they have carried her teaching on to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. So she influenced American music, not just on the tier of what was published and composed and published, but what was taught. So her teaching lives on.
So the whole premise of the novel that you invented Hannah, who is not real,
Mm-hmm.
and yet she interacts so completely with Nadia, who is real,
Yeah.
along with Philip Glass and Leonard Bernstein. As I'm reading the novel, I kept running over to my husband, going, "Now she's talking about Bernstein," because my husband's also a musician, and he's like, "Wow." So how did you do that? How did you? That really kind of struck me, is because it was so real that actually all the way through the novel, I'm going, "Is she actually real?" Because I just dove into the novel. I actually didn't even check if she was real or not. So talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah. So Hannah is made up, and Nadia is real. Leonard Bernstein is real.
Yeah,
Philip
of
Glass
course.
is real. There are a number of other real characters in the
Yeah.
book. I love that idea of incorporating, as I know you do, because I've read your books, incorporating real life people in with folks that are imagined and seeing what happens. Part of my idea with Hannah and Nadia was that you can read about Nadia Boulanger and you'll hear a lot about her harshness and how she wasn't an easy person. And yet you look around and you see these incredible results. So that kind of stuck with me. And I thought, okay, there's more to this story.
Yeah.
And I also felt as though very intentionally, partly for chronology and making sure I could make the timelines work, but it was also intentional that Hannah would be only 10 years old when she comes to Boulanger, and Nadia at that point is 70. So my thinking was, as Nadia ages, does she mellow? Probably not a lot, but perhaps she's a little softer and a little bit more connected to someone who's as young as Hannah. And that their relationship, what I hoped for was that their relationship might be just a little bit different than the relationship that's often been portrayed around her and her students.
Yeah, so that was interesting as a novelist, then. So you could actually work on Boulanger's character development, even though she was real. But
Right.
you could sort of add that into it, which was a nice dimension to the novel. And as you've described, Boulanger is famously unyielding. And
Mhm.
just thinking about music now, what is it about that kind of demanding mentorship that you think shapes an artist, especially in music? Or does it translate to other art forms beyond music? Like, do we need mentors like that?
I think sometimes we do, and sometimes it can be harmful. So
Yes.
I think that in Hannah's case, because she herself is so immersed in music and thinks music, she thinks musically. When she hears her father's horn, car horn, she hears it as dictation. She understands the notes, and she's like, oh, two eighth notes. She hears her mother tapping her spoon, and the same thing happens. She herself is so connected to music, that kind of strict discipline is almost needed so that it doesn't just kind of disperse. I think her musical talents without focus might not have blossomed the way they did. I
Yeah.
think for her, that discipline, that dictatorship from whom she later calls her musical mother, is really helpful for her. But at the same time, you remember in the novel, she also has very different kinds of mentors. Lenny is a really different kind of mentor than Nadia, and they're really an interesting foil for each other in terms of their teaching techniques and their approach to life. And I didn't bring Lenny in simply because of that. Lenny came into the story, and I feel like he's Lenny to me. But he came to the story because I started to think about, okay, if Hannah was 10 in 1959, then she'd be 20 in 1969, and she's a prodigy. So she's going to need more training. She's going to need something. And she evolves into learning to love conducting. And so Nadia, in her role as primary mentor, needs to find her someone else to work with. And Nadia Boulanger had a documented connection with Bernstein in real life.
Yeah.
So that, and I felt like if there was at this moment in time, because part of what we're talking about here is a woman in a man's world.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's all men that are gonna, if she's gonna have an apprenticeship with anybody, it's gonna be a man, right? And I thought, who would be open to that? Who would be open enough to consider taking on a woman, even a woman of incredible talent? Who would that be? And that's where Leonard Bernstein came in.
I'm so glad you had Leonard Bernstein. He's one of my favorites. And I just wanted to circle back to discipline and how discipline is so necessary for creativity. We think, oh, just do what you like. No, in order to actually be good, you do need that discipline. And I love the way that kind of wove in that she was incredibly disciplined. I guess Nadia was too, but so was Hannah. I think sometimes we kind of forget how discipline is needed, especially these days. I think we're getting a little too loose sometimes.
Well,
Like, well, of course, you're a musician. You had to practice scales, right?
right. I
And
think practice, you
yeah,
just said the key word. I think
yes.
so much, for writers, it's just as
Yeah.
important, practice. And it's that repetition, it's that understanding that I need to go back to this. I need to keep working on this. And I feel like my training as a writer is really my musical training in so many ways. It's the idea that we revise until it's right. We practice until those 16th notes sound effortless, right? We want the words to sound just as effortless. And also, my musical background informs my writing because I am very attuned to how something sounds on the page and the rhythm of
I
that.
hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I do think my own musical background, I play piano,
Mm-hmm.
has very much informed my ability to write because all that discipline, all those years and years and
Mm-hmm.
years of practicing, it really does. And being attuned to the words on the page and the
Mm-hmm.
musicality of it, that's very true, actually.
I always think that people sort of dismiss prose, right? I say to my students, prose does not need to be prosaic, I mean, it
Exactly. Well,
can be
you
poetic.
love
Yeah.
words. I
Yeah.
think we all do as
Yeah.
writers. So just circling back to Hannah in a man's world, she's a glass ceiling smashing conductor at the LA
Mm.
Philharmonic. So even to this day, women conductors are really not all that common, are they? I've hardly seen any, and I'm a
Yeah.
symphony goer.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Hannah talks a lot about this in the book,
Yeah.
but there has been this linkage, and Lenny talks about it too, because Lenny acknowledges his struggles coming in as a conductor and not being viewed as macho enough, right? But there is this machismo, and the guy who's at the helm, there's this linkage. There have been a few different books about this. Norman Lebrecht wrote a book called The Maestro Myth that I remember reading early on, working on this book. And yeah, there's kind of an inexplicable linkage. It is changing, but like Hannah says in the book, the current day in the book is 2008. And she talks about how she would have predicted it, that if someone had asked her 10 or 20 years ago, she would have definitely said, oh yeah, there'll be more women. They're coming up. It's going to happen. And that she looks around in 2008 and she's kind of the only one. It has changed. It is changing, but boy, is it slow. But where we do see it changing is in education, in musical education, we see a lot more women coming up. There used to be sort of a barrier to being a high school band director. They could direct the middle school orchestra or the middle school band, but not the high school. That's starting to change. So we're starting to see a shift, but it's slow. Same with women composers. We don't see a lot. So I wanted to play with that. I wanted to play with what does it feel like to be at the top of your game and still have to struggle and still have to struggle with things that a man in your position might not have to.
Yeah. It has nothing to do with your talent and your abilities. It's simply because of your gender. I know it's amazing that we're still dealing with that. So, just talking now about the novel itself, I love the way you've titled the sections of the novel, Overture, Reverie, Rhapsody, and Coda. So, it's like a complete concert. So, why did you decide to structure the novel that way?
For a long time, I was obsessed with this novel being in what is called sonata form.
Ah, right. Yeah,
I let go of that though.
yeah, you did.
But
Okay.
so I it's less like a concert and more like a musical piece in my mind because part of what this book is about is Hannah embracing her own composition work, not just conducting, not simply elevating the work of others, but being able to find space for her own work, which I think is a challenge that we all face as creators. We elevate others, we teach others, we work with others, and then we squirrel away a little bit of time for our own work. And she's trying to get to that place where her work is central. And so I felt like I wanted the book, in a way, to be a composition by Hannah. I felt like there's this idea that she's working on a specific piece that gets premiered towards the end. And I kind of wanted to play with what does that look like. And I also feel like I love musical words. I just love all the words.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I love the way that a word like rhapsody can describe a musical form that could have moments of deep sadness and moments of joy. Rhapsody tends to be a bit of a ride, a carnival ride. And so it also translates well to life. We can have these rhapsodic moments that we think of as really joyous and upbeat, but they tend to be short, right? And so I wanted to play with the words as well.
I was thinking about another kind of theme in your novel is balance. All the way through, Hannah is trying to find some balance between everything for music, but what she had to give up in order to do that, she gave up having a family, for one thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Could she have had both? And part of that is because she's a woman, probably not, and which is really sad, isn't it? But yeah, talk a little bit about her search for balance.
Yeah, well, I think that's also a lot of the interaction between Hannah and Nadia. And for folks who
Yes.
haven't read the book, a good chunk of this book takes place at Nadia Boulanger's gravesite, where Hannah goes and just chats with her. Part of what I wanted to talk about was the very fine line between living and not living, and how
Yeah.
those people who stay with us and are there. So I felt that the challenge that Boulanger issues, and she did in real life, she actually sent sympathy cards to promising students who married on the occasion
Yes,
of
I
their marriage.
remember that bit.
Yeah,
Oh,
that
that's
was true. That's real. You know, she would send a black edge note if she felt there was promising because she felt you had to be married to music. And she especially believed that when it came to women. And she certainly dedicated her life to music and did not have a visible partner. There's some speculation about that. But she really believed that for Hannah, the only path was music. And it was the only safe path, and she keeps talking about that to Hannah, like, this is how you will keep yourself safe.
yeah.
And Hannah basically buys into it. She questions it and she pushes up against it, but she kind of follows
She does.
Nadia's way of thinking there. And but as we meet her in the current day in the novel, she's 58 years old, and she's kind of rethinking this a little bit. She's kind of wondering, is could there be more? Could there be more still? And she has this moment where she has the opportunity to ask this question.
Yes, I know that was very well done. It's very satisfying. We won't get into spoilers, but and another sort of human part of this book is the way you treat grief. I actually teared up several times. reading your novel, having lost loved ones to Alzheimer's and other fairly recently. You
Mm-hmm.
treat that very well. The death of her grandmother
Mm-hmm.
sort of reminded me of my own mother. What was it about grief that you were sort of exploring in this novel?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. One of the things about writing historical fiction and trying to follow the timeline and keep that backbone straight and not divert is that when you invent a character like Hannah and you have her 10 years old in 1959 and aging as she does, and you have her meet Boulanger and you have her meet Bernstein and you have her have parents and grandparents, the real life characters, as it turns out in history, Boulanger died very close to Bernstein's wife, Felicia. He didn't die a lot time later. And so I realized as I was working on this, I'm like, oh my God, there's like this pile up of losses that she suffers. And somehow I compounded it with the passing of her grandmother, but her grandmother kind of had to pass in order for the relationship with Boulanger to address her grandmother's passing. And so there's this cluster of losses that she suffers. And she talks a little bit about that in the book. And she goes to a therapist briefly who says, wow, that's a lot to process. And she realizes, well, I don't know that I did process any of it. I just moved on, right? So I think I feel like the grief component is talking about how we cope or don't cope, how we process, like I said, or don't process. Hannah doesn't really process. She writes music. She writes a piece for Bernstein. She writes Bernstein on Broadway. She reorchestrates his mass. She figures out his whole funeral, all the music. She writes a piece for Felicia. She writes a piece for her grandmother. It's one way of processing. Like there is that artistic processing. We all, I think,
Yeah.
especially as writers, we do it.
Mhm.
But then there's also the not processing because you've pushed it into another form. You've
Yes.
pushed it someplace else, right? And so it kind of catches up with her. And like a few things at this age that she's at are catching up with her. And she's going to have to sort of make decisions about how she moves forward. And so I just wanted the grandmother to be able to see her conduct the Boston Symphony. I just
I
felt like
love
that
that
was,
scene.
so important because her grandfather had played in the BSO and her grandmother is connected to that. But at that point in her life, she's suffering from probably what was vascular dementia because she goes in and out.
Yeah.
She's gone. And then there's this week that they spend together where it's kind of miraculous and her grandmother
Mhm.
is present, but yet that can't last.
I know I found that particularly poignant. My brother was quite a well-known composer in Canada, and he unfortunately passed with
Oh,
Alzheimer's
yeah.
very young, only in his 60s.
Yeah.
And as that's another interesting thing about the novel too, that she's reflecting back. She's 59, as you say, and that is a time of life, being in it more or less myself,
Mhm.
that you do start to reevaluate your life and wondering, okay, was this the right way to go? And so it's great to read a novel centered around a character of that age. Often novels are the protagonists are in their 20s or whatever, which
Mhm.
but people that are closer to in their late 60s or 70s even, I found that really interesting and very very much resonated.
I feel like it's so important. It's part of writing about women, right? It's also writing about older women. It's not, as you said, it's very often even older writers write 34-year-olds or 36-year-olds
Yeah.
or whatever. And when I first started working on this, Hannah was like in her 30s. And she aged as I aged. But seriously, there were various ways that I approached this book, and ultimately I realized, no, let's let's get her to the top of her game, and that's going to take a while, right? Let's
Yeah.
get her to that point where she's got life, it seems like, pretty figured out from the outside. She's had all these successes. She's a groundbreaking conductor. She's a composer who gets her work published. She's got all this success. But then, as you say, she's had to give certain things up. And I wanted to think about, what do we give up? What do we give up as women, as artists, as people, and how do we reclaim or even claim for the first time something that we gave up perhaps without even thinking about it?
I think writing about people that are older, it's showing that we're all a work in progress. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you think she's got everything figured out. She, as you said, she's famous, but she's still kind of a mess, just the way we all are, doesn't matter what age we are. And I think we need to explore that more. There's sort of a tendency, isn't there, to write characters in their 20s and 30s, and then it ends, and then everything will be great for the rest of their lives, which of course is not true. We're always making mistakes and always figuring things out. I'm hoping more and more people write about older characters. I think there's a real gap there, isn't there?
Mhm, mhm.
I, so I'll
Yeah.
talk a little bit about music per se. So both your novel and two of my novels, A Woman of Note and my new one, The Choir, center on women finding power through music in a worlds that would rather they kept silent. Do you think music offers women a particular kind of power or freedom that maybe some other art forms don't?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I don't know.
What is
That
it about music? Because when you think about it, a lot of the groundbreaking developments in history often were through music for women
Mhm.
like Clara Schumann or Mendelssohn. It was through the performing arts that women first came to prominence in some ways.
You know, it's interesting. I'm thinking about your book, A Woman of Note, which I loved, and I'm thinking, uh, there's this element that is stealth about how women
Yes.
take that power, especially in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s, because there was the time where the ladies were expected to learn piano, right?
Of course.
But then there's the ladies who learn piano because they have to learn piano, and then there are the ladies who maybe have a gift. And how does that get nurtured? And I think maybe the freedom that you're describing isn't actually freedom as much as sneakiness. You know, I mean, it's like sort of
Interesting. Yeah.
there's a way in that it's possible the woman knows where she's headed, but those around her don't always know where she's headed. And then maybe there's a way in the performing arts and in music in particular that if you can reach a certain, I'm not even going to say pinnacle, but a certain height, it's harder for the detractors or those folks who don't really want you to be there to take you away from that place.
Yes. Because you're getting attention and people are listening to you. It's a way of getting listened to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's
Many
incredible.
writers and musicians who took men's names or
Yeah.
used initials in order to get past those barriers. Yeah.
Hopefully, we're getting past it now.
One can hope.
As let's talk a minute about Paris.
Mm.
Paris is a real character in your novel. So I presume you went to Paris, spent a lot of time there. So what is it about Paris that makes it the best setting for this story about music and creative rebirth?
Well, conveniently, Nadia Boulanger lived there.
Right.
So,
Kind of had to
as I,
set it there.
right. I didn't have to, but I wanted her. I wanted her there. I wanted her apartment. I wanted her neighborhood. I hadn't been to Paris, as I mentioned, when I started working on this book, and I thought, wow, I'm going to have to get there. And I didn't get there right away. I did a lot of work. I got all these books. I went hunting in used bookshops, and I found this 1958 Life Guide to Paris. And I'm like,
Oh,
perfect, but
cool.
set in 1959, you know. So I found all this stuff that I read. And then I finally got there. I was working on a bookstore project and I had a reason to go to Paris and I stayed a few extra days and that was my first trip and that was also my first trip to Boulanger's grave and I didn't predict that's where I would go. The book was with me and I already knew walking around that very first trip, I thought, wow, this is really confusing. Like, my mind is Hannah right now, and I'm not sure where Kate went. And when I went to the grave, I had this moment of just sobbing, and I didn't know
Oh,
Nadia Boulanger. And I
no.
just sat there and I just found myself sobbing, and I couldn't understand why, but luckily I was in a graveyard, so that was okay.
So that was
Um,
kind of
yeah,
a good place to do it.
yeah, nobody bothered me. And that was also a moment when I realized that what I'd written so far was not the story. And I sort of understood the story in a new way. And I really literally threw out those pages and began again. So that trip really was important. And then I was lucky enough, the work that I had at the time required a lot of flying around. So I accumulated a lot of frequent flyer points.
Mm.
And every time I had enough, I would go to Paris and I was
Yeah.
able to find an apartment through a friend. And I was able to stay at that place each time I went. So I kind of had a base of
Yeah.
operations. So, and I was in Boulanger's neighborhood and I was able to, as Hannah does, visit her regularly, hang out with the cats in the cemetery, do a lot of that stuff. A lot of that stuff is true stuff. And it really helped me understand that that allure of Paris that you hear about, I think, is felt the most just walking around the city, where you just walk around and it's gorgeous and beautiful and kind of crazy. Weird things happen on the street all the time, and you just being able to just wander was a real gift. So I did that
Yes.
quite a bit for about 10 years running, pretty regularly. And I haven't been in quite a while now. Not that I want to go in this heat wave right now, but
No, no, it's
yeah,
apparently it's so
yeah.
amazing. Yeah, we were just there last year. Well, one time
Ah,
we went, we stayed for a full month, and I love that because you could just kind of become a Parisian, sort of,
mm,
except my French is terrible. But yeah, my fourth novel is set in Paris, so I get loving Paris.
yeah, yeah.
So you wrote two memoirs
Hmm.
before this, Cottage for Sale and Remembering the Music, Forgetting the Words.
Yeah.
So what were some of the challenges switching from memoir to fiction?
Well, the truth of the matter is, I was working on this before the memoirs happened. And so
Yeah.
it was more like I switched from fiction to memoir, but nobody knew it. So I was working on this book, and then I live in this tiny little house on Cape Cod, really small. I needed space. I worked from home. I needed extra space. I was constantly trying to figure out how to pull that off. And then I saw this ad in this little newspaper called The Penny Saver that was in existence at the time. And it said cottages for sale must be moved, $3,000 each. And I thought, wow, I'm going to check that out. And there was a story to even, I lost the paper. It took a while before I found the cottages, but eventually I moved to cottage. While that was all going on, I actually went to Paris during that move. I was gone for 3 weeks. Nothing happened during the 3 weeks, so it didn't matter. But as construction projects go, it stalled out. But I was working on the novel, and I kept saying, I'm working on the novel, I'm working on the novel. And these people, these characters, this crazy gruff house mover and the town officials and everyone was a character, and I couldn't resist them ultimately.
Yeah.
And but I kept resisting for a long time, like, nope, you're working on the novel, just get that novel done, this is not a book, and then I'm like, well, maybe it's a children's book, maybe you can have big tractors and colorful trucks. But then finally I gave in and I wrote Cottage for Sale. And that ended up being my first book. And then similarly went back to the novel. My mom became ill. She had Alzheimer's as well, early onset. And people kept saying, oh, you got to write about this. And I kept saying, there is no way I'm writing about this. I seem to have a habit of saying, no, I'm not doing that, and then doing it. But ultimately, a few years after she passed, I published Remembering the Music, Forgetting the Words. And then I returned to the novel again. I would say that in some ways, having worked on the novel for quite a while before I approached my first memoir, I think that it let me feel very free with the memoir. And I had this novelist friend of mine who read the memoir and said, oh my goodness. And he didn't realize I had this novel in my back drawer. He's like, the elements of storytelling, the way that you manipulate the plot, blah, blah, blah. It reads like a novel. I'm like, yeah, but it's all true. But I think that creative nonfiction, memoir, we use
Yeah.
the techniques of fiction writers to tell a true story. And so I think in a funny way, I went from fiction and nonfiction. But then, yes, I feel like the way I decided to approach this novel ultimately in the final version, that it is informed by being a memoirist, because I felt like I could play with almost the idea that this was Hannah's memoir. I didn't have to hit any specific plot points. I could just let her life unfold.
That's interesting. Yeah, the fact that you have written memoirs did make it feel like a memoir. That's
Mhm.
true. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
would you like to do a reading from the Maestro and His Protégé?
Sure. Can I do one little tiny short one and then one little bit longer one? Because the short one sort of sets up
Absolutely.
the longer one. Is that okay? Okay.
You can do anything you want.
You're so kind. So the first chapter of the book is just 6 sentences long. So I'm going to read the first chapter.
Good.
I am your duckling. Though you resisted mothering, I imprinted on you, forming myself in your image. even as I had my small rebellions. Insoumission, you called them. Yes, I am your duckling, mademoiselle, and have returned to you with yellow roses. So that's kind of the setup for the Nadia Hannah relationship. But you don't quite know that yet.
Nice to hear that after having finished the novel and now going back to it. I go, oh, yeah, now I kind of get it.
On the way up the hill, I ducked into the corner bakery. I picked out a ham and cheese croissant for a late lunch, but really, I was there for the melodic, predictable exchange of greetings and thanks, the way the bakery ladies wrapped their treasures with a practiced twist of the wrist. Voila! I paid and sang my part. Merci, madame, au revoir, la di da da di da. You know the melody, right? As I emerged from the bakery, the sun came out, lighting the tops of the buildings. There's an interval after a spring shower on a Paris afternoon that makes you believe in redemption, or at least an active afterlife. By the time I turned onto Rue Rochelle, I had to reach into my purse for my sunglasses. At the gate, another song, Bonjour madame, bonjour monsieur, this time with the guard. I climbed the steps, took a quick right, then a left, following the row of stones, and here you are, on the edge of Division 33, with your father, your mother, your sister, Lily. Boulanger, it says, in raised letters on the weathered marble headstone. The built-in garden atop the tomb needs tending. I'll get to that, I promise. In your marble vase, there's a fresh red rose in the center of the daisies I delivered yesterday. Someone must have visited you this morning, mademoiselle. Another former student, or a student of a student? You died without heirs of the usual kind, but generations of musical lives will be touched by your influence, the legacy of a great teacher. Did you ever consider that while you were living? You were always so practical. You told me more than once that you had to find a way to support your mother and your sister, that the income from teaching was more reliable than the income from composing or conducting or performing. Yet you did all those things until you didn't. You were a gifted teacher, to be sure. Look at the Rose, look at the Copland overtures, the glass operas, I could go on. But you were also terrifying. You drove away as many students as you kept. You were a one-person arbiter of musical futures, certainly the arbiter of mine. But what happened to yours? Why did you retreat to your studio? But if you hadn't, would there be roses in your vase? There's a grave not far from yours, with a giant polished granite pen, the nib stabbing the flat stone. Writer, it says, under a name I've never heard. I don't think I'd want a giant baton on my grave. A little phallic, don't you think? And if that's the case, well, take this writer. Is his death pen sized to his reputation? Or to his ambition? Or is it just a declaration of his eternal manhood? Eternal manhood, what an awful concept. I guess I kind of hope we eventually escape the bonds of gender. Pure spirit, right? I remember years ago, New Year's Eve, 1979 to be precise, my father was still alive, and he and his wife were in New York, and we were visiting Lenny. All afternoon, Dad and Lenny had been riffing on jazz standards. Lenny actually bought my father a clarinet that day when he discovered he played anything for a duet partner. You know Lenny, expansive, the heart of a lion, leonine appetites too. That night it was just the four of us, and the way you do when the year is disappearing, we were talking about time and people passing. Lenny was thinking of Felicia, lost a year earlier to cancer, and I was thinking of Nana and of you. You'd passed away that October. Joanne, my father's wife, wondered aloud if we thought you and Felicia and my grandmother were still around in some form. I like to believe they can hear us now, but I hate to think they can listen in whenever they want, I said. I was still in my 30s and worried about you tuning in to find me in bed with a man. Or watch, Lenny added, as if his thoughts were following mine, like we're some kind of Earth TV. Lenny, Earth TV. If he subscribes, he must have 1,000,000 channels, channel surfing on some giant heavenly remote. And you, mademoiselle? I imagine you would seek out all the great performances. You'd be less interested in the human drama. You'd avoid long talks like the one I plan to have with you. But on the other hand, I know you won't ignore me either. After all, duckling, remember?
Oh, thanks so much. That was great. That brought it all back to me. You had a lot of fun writing this novel, I gather. I know it's hard work, but it also is, it's amazingly rewarding, isn't it, when it works?
Yeah,
Guess
I
that's why
mean,
we keep
you know,
doing it.
right. And I just love the characters. I just wanted to hang out with them. Like, I wish I had an Emil. People are like, who did you model Emil on? I'm like, oh, Emil is like my ideal uncle or something. You know, like I have a great uncle, but Emil able to mentor her in a way and comfort her in a way that Nadia wasn't able to,
Yeah.
and that she's able to reconnect with him when she's older. So a lot of it really is for me. I'm absolutely, as I said earlier, I write from character. I follow the character. I see what the character wants to do, and I don't do a lot of manipulating. My manipulating is mostly to make sure the history lines up correctly in a book like
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Of course, that's the fun part when you sit down to write and then they just take off and do what they're going to do.
Mhm.
I love that when it happens. So, one of my goals with the Art and Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So, what is one thing you learned from writing this novel that you didn't know before?
I think I learned that I loved Paris.
Ah, of course.
I mean, I think the setting was so different from certainly Cottage for Sale's Cape Cod, the land of fleece and bathing suits. So I think the ability to be there and the ability to go there was such a gift. And to be able to do that and immerse myself in that place and be able to walk by Nadia Boulanger's apartment and stare up at the windows where I knew all this happened, and to hang out at her grave, to go to the church where not only was she baptized, but her funeral was held, and most importantly, Lily's, her sister's funeral was held. To sort of be there, to go to the grocery store at the end of the street and think, I wonder if there's a grocery store book and it's based on that grocery store. Was it there when she was there? I don't know, but it's fun to kind of walk the streets and inhabit. I feel like in some ways, you know, they talk about method acting. I feel like a lot of this was method writing. When I was writing there, I would write really late at night. Someone asked me, what's the right time to write? And I said, you know, I really think it depends on the project. And this book liked to be written late at night. Cottage liked to be written early in the morning, you know? So follow the characters, follow the thing. So I guess another thing I learned is that it's okay to follow the characters, and that there are a lot of people in the world who will tell you that you need to plot everything out and that you need to have a plan. And I think if you write cozy mysteries, that's probably pretty important, because you got to make sure that red herring, that murder has to happen on page 54, and that red herring has to, you know,
Mhm.
you need to do that. But I think if you open yourself up to a more expansive view, and even working within the historical fiction realm, I think you can still follow character and have a really great time.
It occurred to me there's a lot of energy in this novel because it goes back and forth between the two timelines. When you're actually writing it, did you do it that way, or did you have like longer stretches and then you chopped it up later?
No, I did not chop it up later. I always knew it was going to go back and forth, but in my early drafts, it was really hard to follow because I was resistant. I was into this whole musical idea, so I was resistant to chapters early on. So I had chapters, but not so much. They were more like sections. You know, it's
Yeah.
always had sections. It's always had beats. I've always had that, but it was kind of a big mess. It wasn't what I wanted it to be, but I wasn't sure what it needed to be, you know, in early drafts. But I'm somebody who loves revision. Like, I love
I do
digging in.
too.
I love cutting stuff. I love, you know, just making it tight, making sure, you know, Boulanger always talked about how every note must have a reason. It must have a
Yeah.
reason to exist. And I feel like every word should have a reason to exist. I feel like Boulanger guides the writing as well as the music.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote of hers about paying attention, and basically every moment of inattention is a moment lost. And she really believed that you had to pay attention. And she was, besides her great musical mind, she paid attention to everything in the world and could talk about politics, could talk about languages, had this amazing mind that absorbed, but it wasn't passive. She
Mhm.
paid attention. And I think that's another thing that we can take from her that carries over beautifully to writing.
Well, it's the creative process, isn't it? And it
Yeah,
really doesn't matter in a way what the medium is, whether it is music or writing or art. It is that ability to create something out of nothing,
right.
which is so exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, and to notice something that
Hmm.
maybe other people don't see. you're paying attention so you notice something, and that could be the spark of a whole story or a symphony. It could be the spark of anything, you know.
Well, we don't know where it came from. Well, thank you so much, Kate, for chatting with me. We just covered so many things.
Well, it was a delight, absolute delight. Thank you for having me here. And I can't wait. I have the choir, but I haven't started it yet. So I'm looking forward to that. It's right on my desk. See, I can prove it. You know, we always like to hold up the book. So here's
Oh, you
yours.
actually have the real book.
I have the real
Yay!
book. Yep, I have the real book. Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Good. Well, I hope you enjoy it.
I know I'm going to.